On a cold January night in 1978, inside a quiet home in Woodland Hills, California, a guitar legend laughed for the last time. Terry Kath, the wild heart and soul of the band Chicago, was surrounded by friends, half drunk, half lost. His Fender still glowing under the dim kitchen light. He lifted a pistol, smiled, and said, "Don't worry, it's not loaded." Seconds later, a single shot shattered the silence. The man Jimi Hendrix once called better than me was gone at just 31. Behind his electrifying riffs and roaring crowds, Kath carried a storm. Addiction, exhaustion, and the unbearable weight of fame. His story was not just about music, but about the darkness that fame refused to heal. This is the untold truth of Terry Kath. Welcome to Hollywood Mysteries. Long before the roaring guitars and the sold-out arenas, Terry Kath's life was shaped by silence. The kind that grows inside homes where dreams are not easily understood. Born in Chicago in 1946, he was the restless son of a working-class family who valued stability far more than art. His father wanted him to find a real job, a phrase that hung in the air like a warning. But Terry's world was already filled with sound. The echo of church organs, the hum of neighborhood jukeboxes, and the hypnotic pulse of early rock and roll. From an early age, he learned that rebellion could be melodic. He built his first guitar with his own hands, scavenging parts, wiring, and imagination. That act, the creation of something imperfect yet alive, became his first declaration of independence. But with independence came isolation. He practiced until his fingers bled, long after his friends had gone home. His mother worried he was becoming obsessed. His father thought he was wasting his future. Terry didn't argue. He just turned the amplifier louder. The emotional divide in the Kath household grew wider. The young musician felt both invisible and unstoppable. He joined local bands, each one a small rebellion against the life that was expected of him. One group, Jimmy Rice and the Gentlemen, gave him a taste of stage light and audience noise. A drug that would later become far more dangerous than any chemical. The more he played, the more he drifted away from family dinners, from conversations about safety and success. He was chasing a sound that only he could hear. By his early 20s, the Vietnam era had turned the air electric. Chicago was a city on edge. Protests, riots, the fading innocence of America. Terry poured that tension into his music. His riffs were like sirens, loud, emotional, unpredictable. In those moments, he wasn't just playing. He was exercising something buried deep. Friends would later describe him as a man who played like he had something to prove. They weren't wrong. Every note was an argument with his past, with a world that never believed in the artist within him. But even as his talent became undeniable, so did the cracks. He never fully escaped the need for approval. The ache that came from trying to earn love through performance. On stage, he was fearless. Off stage, he second-guessed everything. He drank to quiet his mind, to fill the spaces where silence used to live. He joked constantly, masking vulnerability with humor. Bandmates adored him for his warmth, but behind the jokes was a man terrified of being ordinary. The early sessions that would later form Chicago Transit Authority were more than recordings. They were therapy sessions captured on tape. Kath's playing was raw, defiant, spiritual. He blended rock, jazz, and soul into something new. A sound that mirrored the chaos of his own emotions. His Fender Telecaster became his confession booth, his amplifier, the priest. He didn't speak about pain. He transformed it into distortion, feedback, and fire. Yet, the more success approached, the more unstable the foundation beneath him became. Fame was a bridge between the misunderstood boy and the man the world was beginning to celebrate. But it was built on unresolved pain. The boy who once sought validation from his father now sought it from millions of strangers. Each applause was a temporary cure, a momentary illusion that the noise could drown out his doubts. One night, after a show in a smoky club on Chicago's North Side, a fan shouted, "You're gonna be huge, man!" Terry smiled, but his bandmates noticed the distant look in his eyes. He wasn't dreaming about fame. He was wondering what it would take to feel whole. Every artist carries a ghost. Terry carried his from childhood into every song. His ghost whispered of control, of expectations, of love withheld until it was too late. And that whisper, soft, insistent, cruel, would follow him from the small neighborhood stages of Illinois to the blinding spotlight of the world. The foundation of his genius was laid not in music schools or fame, but in those lonely nights of self-doubt and defiance. When a boy learned that the only way to be heard in a world of silence was to play louder than the pain. By 1967, Chicago was vibrating with a new kind of energy. A crossroads where jazz met rock and rebellion became melody. Amid that noise, Terry Kath emerged like a spark no one could control. His guitar tone, thick, soulful, and ferocious, didn't imitate anyone. It demanded to be heard. When the group that would later become Chicago began to form, it wasn't just another band. It was a collision of ambition, intellect, and raw electricity. And at the heart of it stood Terry, the unspoken leader, the musical engine, the emotional compass. When Chicago Transit Authority debuted in 1969, the world took notice. Their sound was big, brassy, unapologetic. And Terry's guitar carved through the horns like lightning through a storm. Critics called him a white man playing with black soul. Hendrix himself, upon hearing him play, allegedly said, "That guy's better than me." It was the kind of compliment that could make a career or destroy a psyche. For Terry, it did both. The 1,970 seconds rolled in with superstardom. Chicago's albums went platinum. They sold millions of records, dominated radio, and filled stadiums from New York to Tokyo. Terry's performances became mythic. 10-minute solos, sweat flying, audiences hypnotized. But behind that blaze of genius, he was burning out. Fame, like fire, consumes its fuel quickly. In interviews, bandmates later recalled how Terry seemed to live on the edge of chaos. Part artist, part daredevil. He would rehearse with a cigarette dangling from his mouth, eyes half closed, lost somewhere between transcendence and exhaustion. On stage, he looked invincible. Off stage, he was fraying. The endless touring schedules, the pressure from management, the creative control struggles, they all began to gnaw at his spirit. Terry was never meant to be a product, but the machine of success had no brakes. Manager James William Guercio, the mastermind behind Chicago's meteoric rise, had built an empire around them. Studios, contracts, and control. By the mid-70s, Guercio owned a ranch in Colorado where the band recorded, slept, and lived under his watch. Caribou Ranch was supposed to be a sanctuary. For Terry, it became a gilded cage. He hated the corporate politics, the endless compromises, the way art became accounting. As Chicago grew wealthier, Terry grew more restless. He watched as decisions about his music, his band, even his own voice were filtered through lawyers and producers. His passion for purity, the same force that made him a genius, now made him impossible to manage. Drugs became the great equalizer. Cocaine and alcohol were part of the industry's bloodstream, and Terry was no exception. It dulled the frustration, softened the anger, blurred the fear. "If I don't get things under control," he once told drummer Danny Seraphin, "this stuff is going to kill me." It wasn't a metaphor. It was prophecy. Still, there were flashes of clarity. Between 1974 and 1976, Chicago was unstoppable. Chicago, the 7th, 8, and X stormed the charts. Their live shows were spectacles of precision and energy. Fans screamed for Terry's solos. Journalists compared him to Clapton, Beck, and Page. Yet the price of that perfection was staggering. The band worked like soldiers, recording, rehearsing, touring, repeating. He missed birthdays, anniversaries, moments with his young daughter, Michelle. His marriage to Camila Ortiz strained under the weight of distance and fatigue. Letters home turned into phone calls, then silence. Fame gave him everything but peace. He was adored by millions, and yet, more than ever, alone. Friends described how Terry's humor turned darker. His once playful sarcasm edged into bitterness. At parties, he'd go from laughing to withdrawn in seconds. He'd vanish mid-conversation, guitar slung over his shoulder, disappearing into a corner to play alone. His music had always been his escape, but now it was also his prison. When the band's relationship with Guercio collapsed in 1977, it should have been liberation. Instead, it left a vacuum. For the first time, Terry felt untethered. A man without a map. The machinery that had once controlled him was gone, but so was the structure that held him upright. His creativity exploded, but scattered. He began talking about a solo project, one that would let him rediscover the freedom he'd lost. He wanted to make music again. Not product, his daughter Michelle would later recall. But the industry wasn't built for freedom. It was built for repetition. The more Terry tried to reinvent himself, the more he felt the pull of the old ghosts. The need to please, to prove, to escape. His experimentation grew riskier. Nights bled into mornings. Rehearsals turned into drinking sessions. Cocaine replaced sleep. Sleep replaced joy. His friends worried, but he brushed them off with a grin. "I'm fine," he'd say, lighting another cigarette, pouring another drink. His charisma made it impossible to confront him. Everyone thought they had time. They didn't. By late 1977, the cracks had become fractures. Terry's body was showing the toll. Pale skin, trembling hands, a distant look in his eyes. But on stage, he was still extraordinary. There's footage from those final months where he seems both divine and doomed. A man channeling every ounce of his soul through a guitar as if it were a life raft. The audience heard brilliance. He was playing for survival. The last shows he played with Chicago had a strange, unspoken melancholy. The applause was thunderous, but inside the band, there was unease. a sense that something precious was slipping away. Terry still joked, still played, still promised he'd get clean. He even told friends he'd quit cocaine. But addiction is a magician. It makes promises it never keeps. By the end of that year, the legend of Terry Kath, the genius, the rebel, the reluctant rock star, stood at a crossroads. He had fame, fortune, and a band that defined a generation. Yet behind the amplifiers and the anthems was a man quietly disintegrating. The harder he tried to control the chaos, the faster it consumed him. The boy who once built his own guitar to escape silence was now surrounded by noise. The kind that deafens from within. And as 1978 approached, so did the final act of his story. The night when laughter, music, and destiny would meet in one fatal chord. Love, for Terry Kath, was never a gentle thing. It came with the same intensity as his music. Wild, consuming, and self-destructive. Those who knew him said he loved with a kind of fever, the way he played guitar, all in, no hesitation. Yet beneath the laughter, the jokes, and the warmth, he carried an ache that intimacy could never quiet. It wasn't a woman that destroyed him, but something far more insidious. A love affair with danger itself. By the late 1970 seconds, his two greatest companions were his guitar and his gun. On stage, the guitar was his salvation. Off stage, the gun became his fixation. It started as a fascination with mechanics, a collector's curiosity. But as his mind grew restless, and his moods swung between brilliance and despair, the weapon turned into something symbolic, almost romantic. He wore it like an extension of himself, as if the same hands that could create beauty could also hold destruction. Friends remembered the way he'd pull the gun from his belt at parties, spinning it like a toy, laughing as people winced. "Relax," he'd say. "It's not loaded." It was his dark party trick. One that terrified everyone except him. Some saw it as a reflection of his daredevil spirit. Others sensed something more troubling, a man who needed to feel in control of something after losing control of everything else. At the same time, the cracks in his personal life were widening. His marriage to Camelia Ortiz, the woman who had once grounded him, had grown distant. Terry adored his daughter Michelle, but the chaos of touring and addiction had made him an inconsistent presence. The letters home had stopped. The phone calls came less often. His friends could see the guilt in his eyes when her name came up. He'd change the subject, pour another drink, and make everyone laugh again. Humor was his last defense. Behind the jokes, however, was a man unraveling. His bandmates had watched him drift further into the haze. The mix of cocaine, sleepless nights, and endless touring had sharpened his edges. He was volatile, unpredictable. Some nights he was tender and reflective, others manic and reckless. He was burning at both ends, one member later said, and he didn't know how to stop. Why? Why have Mose? The gun followed him everywhere. It sat on tables, in guitar cases, on car seats. Terry often said it made him feel safe, though no one was sure from what. Perhaps it wasn't protection he sought, but control. The illusion that in a life dictated by record labels, schedules, and addiction, he still had power over something as final as death. During the final months of 1977, that illusion deepened. He spoke to friends about starting over, getting clean, recording his solo album, being a better father. But there was a fatigue in his voice, a sense that he was running out of time. When he did show up for rehearsals, he'd sometimes forget lyrics, slur jokes, or disappear mid-song. Still, when the music started, everything clicked. On stage, he was the Terry everyone loved, magnetic, soulful, unstoppable. Off stage, he was fading. Those close to him remember one night in particular. A quiet gathering at a friend's house in Woodland Hills. Terry seemed lighter than usual, almost peaceful. He played a few songs on his guitar, sang softly, smiled. He joked about quitting drugs. He even promised his friends he was getting his life back on track. No one realized they were witnessing the final calm before the storm. Later that night, in the small hours of the 23rd of January 1978, the mood was easy. The group drank, laughed, shared stories. Someone noticed the gun sitting on the kitchen counter. "Be careful with that thing," one of them warned. Terry waved it off with his signature grin. "It's not loaded," he said. The same line he'd said 100 times before. He raised the pistol, pointing it playfully toward his own head. "Don't worry," he laughed. "I'm not that stupid." Why? Why have Mose? In a single, irreversible moment, the joke became tragedy. A loud crack tore through the air. Silence followed. The kind of silence that ends a life. The gun, it turned out, was loaded. The news spread like wildfire. The band was devastated. The music world, stunned. Newspapers called it a freak accident. Fans refused to believe it. Some whispered theories. Suicide, conspiracy, cover-up. But those who knew him knew better. Terry wasn't suicidal. He was reckless, lost inside a dangerous dance with fate. In the hours before his death, he had spoken about his future, about music, about change. His daughter would later say he was trying to find his way back to life, not escape it. But fate had already written the final verse. The tragedy wasn't just in the act itself, but in the cruel irony of it. A man who had survived fame, addiction, exhaustion, and inner torment. A man who could make a guitar sing like a soul set free. Was undone by a moment of careless laughter. His death wasn't premeditated. It was the ultimate accident of a man who had lived too fast for too long. To the outside world, the story ended that night, in Woodland Hills. But for those who loved him, it marked the beginning of a lifelong question. Why him? How could a man so full of life, so close to redemption, fall victim to his own fatal playfulness? That question would echo through decades, haunting the band, his family, and his fans. His death wasn't just an ending. It was a mirror held up to the culture that created him. A world that demanded brilliance, but never cared what it cost. And in that quiet house, as the echoes of the gunshot faded, the legend of Terry Kath, the rebel, the genius, the man who laughed too close to the edge, was sealed forever. The morning after the gunshot, Los Angeles awoke to headlines that didn't seem real. Terry Kath, dead at 31. For a generation of fans, it felt impossible. The man whose guitar had carried a band, whose energy filled stadiums, now reduced to a tragic footnote. But, for those closest to him, the real shock wasn't just his death. It was the silence that followed. In a world that had fed on his sound, the quiet was unbearable. Inside the Chicago camp, disbelief hung heavy. Bandmates refused to accept the idea of suicide. They knew Terry's optimism, his humor, his plans for a solo project. It wasn't despair that killed him. It was the culture that told men like him they could play with fire and walk away unburned. His death was a symbol of something larger, something woven deep into the fabric of 1,970 seconds rock, excess, mistaken for freedom. The coroner's report called it accidental self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. There was no evidence of foul play, no suicide note. But toxicology tests revealed traces of alcohol and cocaine in his system, the familiar ghosts of his final years. He hadn't been out of control that night. He had simply been too comfortable with danger. For years, he had lived like that, testing fate, convinced he could charm his way out of its grasp. At his funeral, the air was thick with grief and disbelief. Hundreds gathered. Musicians, friends, fans, all struggling to understand how a man so full of light could die by his own hand. James Pankow wept openly. Danny Seraphine spoke about a brother lost too soon. They played Color My World and Make Me Smile, songs that once pulsed with joy now turned elegiac. For the first time, the band that had always sounded larger than life was silent. In the weeks that followed, Chicago faced a choice: dissolve or carry on. The wound was raw, but the machine of fame couldn't stop. They decided to continue, dedicating their next album to Terry's memory. Yet no matter how polished their sound became, something was missing. That raw, fearless spirit that only he brought. Without him, the band's chemistry changed forever. He was the soul of Chicago, Seraphine later said. After Terry, it was never the same. And where he bid word Doc, the tragedy rippled beyond the band. For Terry's daughter, Michelle, barely 2 years old at the time, her father existed as a myth before he became a memory. Growing up, she heard whispers, fragments, half-truths. The accident, the legend, the man who laughed and died. As an adult, she went searching for the truth herself. Her 2016 documentary, The Terry Kath Experience, wasn't just a film. It was an act of resurrection. In the documentary, Michelle sits in front of her father's guitar, the battered Fender Telecaster he'd named the Peanut. It still bore the marks of his fingers, the burns from his cigarettes. When she strummed it for the first time, the instrument hummed like a ghost awakened. Through interviews, old footage, and unreleased tapes, she pieced together the father she never knew. She discovered not a rock god, but a man torn between brilliance and fragility. One scene stands out, a letter Terry wrote years before his death, tucked away in a drawer. It was tender, apologetic. A man trying to explain the unexplainable. "Music is the only place I know who I am," he wrote. "Everything else feels like noise." Those words, more than any headline, capture the truth of Terry Kath. A man consumed by sound, chasing meaning through distortion. Decades later, his story resonates with painful clarity. It isn't just about one musician's recklessness. It's about an era that worshipped chaos and called it art. The 1,970 seconds rock world was littered with casualties. Hendrix, Morrison, Joplin, Moon, all gone before 35. Terry's death was part of that pattern, a warning ignored. For every fan screaming at the front row, there was a man on stage disintegrating under the weight of expectation. His addiction, like so many of his peers, wasn't about pleasure. It was about control. Cocaine gave him energy when his body couldn't keep up. Alcohol softened the pressure of fame. Together, they became his armor. But armor, when worn too long, becomes a coffin. The statistics tell their own story. By 1978, overdoses and accidental deaths among touring musicians had risen by nearly 300% compared to the start of the decade. The industry knew, yet no one slowed down. Terry's death was one more data point in a silent epidemic of burnout and denial. The haunting irony is that his death might have been preventable. Friends recalled that he had handed the clip of the gun to a roadie minutes before, believing the weapon was safe. "He thought it was empty," said Don Johnson, the technician who witnessed it. "He just didn't realize there was still a bullet in the chamber." A split-second miscalculation. That's all it took to end a life that had been defying odds from the beginning. Over the years, myths grew. Some fans whispered of depression, others of hidden intent. But his family's words are clear. Terry Kath didn't want to die. He wanted to start over. He was planning new music, cleaning up, rediscovering himself. He talked about recording songs that were simpler, more honest, stripped of industry demands. He had even spoken about taking time off to focus on being a father. The cruel twist of fate is that he died just as he was finally learning how to live. In the decades since, his legend has deepened. Guitarists still speak of him with reverence. The musician's musician, the player who could channel jazz, blues, and rock into one blistering sound. Fans still debate how he achieved his tone. Part Fender Telecaster, part mysticism. Modern rock magazines call him the forgotten genius of the 1,970 seconds. A man overshadowed by his band's pop success, but revered by those who truly listen. What remains most haunting is the duality of his story. The joy and the danger, the laughter and the gun. His death serves as a mirror to every artist who's ever felt trapped between their gift and their demons. It's a warning written in the language of tragedy, that brilliance without balance always collapses inward. Today, his daughter keeps his legacy alive through the Terry Kath Foundation, promoting awareness around mental health and musician safety. The very conversations that never existed in his time. Her work reframes his story not as a cautionary tale, but as a call for compassion, to see the human behind the hero, the father behind the legend. When the Terry Kath Experience premiered, audience members wept. Not because they saw another rock star's fall, but because they saw themselves. The longing to be understood, the fear of not being enough, the fragile beauty of second chances that never come. Terry's final words, immortalized through those who heard them, were simple, tragic, and unbearably human. "Don't worry, it's not loaded." They echo like an epitaph for a generation that mistook fearlessness for immortality. In the end, his story is not about how he died, but how he lived. With unfiltered passion, humor, and defiance. He didn't chase fame, he chased freedom. He didn't fear death, he underestimated it. And though his body fell silent in that kitchen on a January night, his music continues to roar. Defiant, alive, eternal. Because in every distorted chord, in every soaring note, there's a piece of him. The boy from Chicago who refused to fade quietly. This is the tragic truth of Terry Kath. A man who lived too loud for the world to handle, and too brightly for it to forget.